1 with the petition which is calling for grant an urgent amnesty to undocumented migrants living in the UK. This petition attracted 103,440 signatures, and I would like to thank each and every one of those people for participating in our democracy and signing that petition, which of course led us to where we are today to debate this very important issue. I think what's quite clear from the petition is that it's sort of COVID-19 has added a bit of an impetus with regards to this petition and the decision to sign it. There has been concern about the ability of undocumented migrants to get access to a vaccine, which of course is of benefit both to them but also to wider society, because we know that the more people who have the vaccine are less likely to transmit the virus. So, that is clearly seems to have given it a bit of an added impetus, and the fact that having quite a unstable existence is made even more challenging through COVID-19. Like many things, COVID-19 has made challenging situation more challenging. So I can very much understand the decision of the 103,440 people to sign the petition such as they have today. In terms of what is being called for, well, I mean, really, it is as simple as granting an amnesty to all undocumented migrants living in the UK, except those who have a criminal record. That the petition was quite clear that it doesn't believe if you have a criminal record, you should be the beneficiary of this amnesty. But I have to say there's not much more detail than that. So I assume that this petition, if it got what it wished, would essentially treat every undocumented migrant the same, whether they were someone who'd been living here for, say, over 10 years and had put down extensive family roots, or somebody who, quite frankly, arrived here last weekend on a dinghy from Calais. So I think that's something which the petition is sort of missing. There isn't that clarity with regards to, so I'm assuming it's essentially referring to every single undocumented migrant. I can only assume that. And of course, I may also assume that this is going to be a one-off amnesty for all undocumented migrants. But I'm not unsure about whether the petitioners would wish there to be something that happens routinely. I don't know, every 5 years, every 10 years. That is also not clear. But what is clear is a desire to regularise the status for all undocumented migrants. That is very clear, and that is what we will be debating today. I mean, the arguments in favour, I think, are clear. I think there are many individuals and families who are undocumented migrants who have come here. Some may have come here illegally in the first instance. Some may have come here legally in the first instance, but the legal time which they're allowed to be here has expired, and they're looking to regularise the position in which they're in. So there's a combination of both of those. But there are many who are making a positive contribution to our country in difficult circumstances. And at the moment, it's a very challenging situation for them. There's also an argument about how actually by regularising their status, it leads to them paying more taxes, and that's beneficial to the taxpayer. So those are sort of some of the arguments that have been made. I, for one, can have some sympathy with the argument that says that actually we should treat you a bit different if you've been here for, say, 10 years or 12 years and you put down extensive family roots. I mean, is it really realistic? Is it really likely at that stage that as a government we are going to deport you? I think it's incredibly unlikely. And if we are of the view that it's incredibly unlikely that we're ever going to deport you in those circumstances, then there does seem to be a pretty strong argument in relation to those individuals that we should regularise their status, and that perhaps an argument could be made for there being an amnesty. But in terms of the arguments against, in relation to this petition, I simply wouldn't be able to support a situation where we were treating a family who may have been here for over 10 years the same as somebody who, say, came here last weekend on a dinghy. We also cannot make assumptions about every single person who's in this category. I mean, the reality is that there will be some people who have come into this country illegally through that illegal route, who we don't know if they're a genuine refugee. It's impossible to know whether all of them will be. Amongst that, there will be some economic migrants. So ultimately, those individuals would likely be the beneficiary of such a blanket move as is being suggested by this petition, and that is something that I don't think I could support. if we were to support what this petition is calling for, which is a blanket amnesty for every single undocumented migrant, I find it impossible to sustain that position whilst at the same time not being in favour of open borders. Because I find it very difficult to understand how you could adopt this position and potentially have it done regularly every 5 years, every 6 years, and not be in support of open borders. So allow me to progress. So I find it, and as somebody, as a member of parliament of this country, I would not ever support open borders. I think it would put unsustainable amounts of pressure on our public services. I think there'd be all sorts of problems with social integration if it was completely unmanaged to that extent. And I also think it would limit our ability as a country to show compassion towards the most genuine of refugees, but also to have a laws-based, rules-based immigration system that allows us to welcome the brightest and the best who want to come to this country to make a positive contribution. In terms of and also, more to the point, I think it would be a slap in the face for all of those people who have moved to this country legally, who have followed the rules, often cumbersome, but they followed them. They've done their side of the bargain, and they've moved here legally. I think this would be a slap in the face to them. Yes, all taken intervention.
Does the honourable member know that a lot of these people that we are talking about who are undocumented migrants have come here legally, and they're undocumented not through any fault of their own? Does he accept that?
Well, with the greatest of respect to the honourable member, I did make the point that here this petition would apply to both those who may have entered the country illegally, but also those who may have entered legally, but for a fixed period of time. That period of time has expired. So yes, it's a mixture here. We've got which is why I'm against the blanket nature of this petition. I think it would be a significant movement away from a case-by-case approach the government is currently taking, which I think takes into account the differences and the nuances between different circumstances. This would not do that. Yes, there'd be individuals within who would benefit from this amnesty, who could have come here legally, but whose time's expired, who are struggling with the process, and who have been here for 10 years and are making a positive contribution. But it would also include those people who have shunned the laws of our country, who have come here illegally, deliberately, and who frankly have no more right to be here than the family or the individuals who are patiently waiting to come here legally. And that is the reality of the situation, in my view. We are also talking at a time where we think, we are dealing with a challenge, the government is dealing with a significant challenge with regards to the illegal crossings from Calais. And of course, this is a situation where individuals, regardless of the circumstances they're in, are knowingly deciding to not engage with a legal process for claiming asylum or moving. No, I'm not going to take another intervention, or come here or immigrate here in a legal way, but have decided to shun that legal approach and come here in an illegal manner. And I do think that the danger of a blanket motion such as this is it would send out a message to all of those people prepared, who are coming over illegally, fueling an evil trade in human lives, and it would actually potentially make the situation a lot worse. And I think that the demand, the money fueling this evil trade in human lives would increase, and potentially more lives would be risked. Because if we do adopt a position like this, which is very closed down open borders immigration policy, essentially the message is, once you're in, you're in. So get over here, ignore the processes, because it's worth the risk. And the risk is very real, and the risk could lead to the loss of lives. I'm very happy to take an intervention.
Excellent. Would the honourable member be surprised to hear then that his own Prime Minister has toyed with the idea of exactly what they're calling for in this, an amnesty for anybody who's been here for a certain period of time, and he still has talked about it recently?
With the greatest of respect, if you've read the petition motion, you would see that this is not what this petition is calling for. This petition mentions nothing to do with being here for 10 years. It is essentially, it is a blanket amnesty for every single undocumented migrant. It is not, there have been a number of people across the political spectrum who have floated and supported the idea of a limited amnesty targeted at those who say have been here for over 10 years. And I said earlier in my speech that I do believe that there are some merits in those arguments. This petition is not calling for that. This petition is calling for a situation that sits very closely to an open border policy, in my view. And I think it would lead to chaotic results, unintended consequences, unsustainable pressure on public services, problems of social integration, and would, as I said earlier, limit the capacity of us to promote a compassionate, generous, rules-based immigration system and approach to refugee resettlement that could benefit this country, and I believe is supported by a majority of people in this country. So that's sort of the wider picture. But in terms of the government's current position, we can argue that there will, of course, be examples of where the status quo fails individuals and fails individual families, and we need to work with that system to improve its efficiency, how quickly it deals with these cases, so it can turn them around as quickly as possible and get them that outcome they need as soon as possible, so they can plan their lives with certainty. Of course, that is something that I support, but of course the government is in a position, current government position is that if you've been in the country for a long period of time, then there are opportunities to regularise your status. But I think it's appropriate and it is fair that is done on a case-by-case basis, because we cannot make huge generalisations with regards to those who come under the category which we're talking about today, because the motives vary, the circumstances vary enormously. So in conclusion, Mr. Chair, though I sympathise with the motivation and for reasons why the people today have signed this petition, and also their concern for the circumstances many of these people's face at the moment, I think that it is not focused enough in what it is calling for. To me, this is very much a blanket amnesty for every single person, many of whom have come here illegally and shunned the legal process. It would be a slap in the face for those who have come here legally. And I think it would be serious unintended consequences. And you know what? If the honourable members who are taking part in this debate believe in this motion as it stands in front of us today, then run with it in the manifesto in the general election. And I think that there'd be a resounding answer from the British people, which would be they would not support this. A vast majority of people in this country see the benefits of immigration. They are compassionate towards refugees, but they want a rules-based system. And this would fly in the face of that. So for all of those reasons, Mr. Chairman, I, as a member of Parliament, would be unable to support it. But I'm glad it's going to have good hearing today. And having looked at the call list, I predict that perhaps we'll hear some different arguments raised from the ones I've raised. And there probably won't be much reiteration of the arguments I've just made until perhaps the end of the debate. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 56761 related to an amnesty for undocumented migrants. I'm going to put an informal time limit of 5 minutes at the moment, and we'll see where we get to with that. Virendra Sharma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's always a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Undocumented migrants are not some enemy of the state. They are not a risk to this country. A vast majority have been desperate people keen to work and secure a future for themselves and their families. It is with that in mind that they must be given the legal right to live and work in the UK, which will give them the chance to prosper in this country and stand on their own feet, not treated like criminals. It is obvious that the majority of undocumented migrants are in some form of work, albeit illegal and in all likelihood exploitative. I strongly believe that such migrants will have undoubtedly honed their skills and developed their knowledge and experience since they first moved here, and that they are all desperate to contribute to this country. At a time when UK employers are suffering from the most profound labor shortage in a generation, we should be turning to a hardworking, talented, and resilient resource which already exists here in the UK, undocumented migrants. Far from the picture painted of them by some members, a recent Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants survey estimates that 82% of those entered who the UK through legal routes and later fell out of status. According to their research, a migrant on the 10-year route to settlement will have paid £13,000 in application fees by the time they are granted indefinite leave to remain. The sheer cost and complexity of this broken system forces those who are here legally to then become undocumented. Once they fall out of the status, it is extremely difficult and unlikely that they will receive it a second time. This bewildering system limits the life chances of our vulnerable and puts them at risk of rank exploitation from rogue employers and those who seek to prey on the defenseless. Under the government's hostile environment, their situation has become even more precarious. I was shocked and disturbed by the report of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism last week, which showed that most GP surgeries in the UK refuse to register undocumented migrants in spite of NHS policy. Not only is this position cruel and denies those the help they desperately need, but it is holding back our aim of vaccinating every adult in the UK and of beating this hideous disease. This policy puts us all at greater risk. The chair, I wrote to the Home and Health Secretaries on this point, which they ultimately agreed with, though pressure must now be put on the GP practices. Among the despair, there is still great hope among migrants. During the recent annual Refugee Week at the end of June, I took part in the Working West London Employment event hosted by ELAT, who offer training and skills development courses for the refugees and migrants. I met a group of who were crying out to contribute to this country, and I could see the rich array of skills, talents, and passion they have to offer. Mr. Chairman, I believe that migrants play such an important role in our society and are a statement of who we are. Not only are they people with aspirations and hopes, but they also represent our values. They demonstrate our humanity and decency. To the majority here in the debate today, and the 100,000 people who signed the e-petition, it is clear that the government must urgently reform our immigration system to prevent people from falling out of status and simplify the routes to regularization. A commitment to an amnesty by the government could only ever be the beginning of this, which should be swiftly followed by a fundamental reform of our immigration system and by ditching the hostile environment. This change is not just the right thing to do. It will benefit this country and everyone living here. The government must show some flexibility, pragmatism, and humanity, principles which have long been at the heart of British policymaking, and give undocumented migrants the chance to truly succeed and contribute in our society. Thank you, Chairman.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Hosey, and it's a great pleasure to speak under your chairmanship. This will be quite a short speech. Most migrants into the UK have taken the trouble to apply properly through our immigration system. And here in Gravesend, we're living with a highly successful immigration, notably the Sikh community. But a blanket amnesty such as this is not sensible if it refers to every undocumented migrant. This potentially proposes to allow tens of thousands of people, more perhaps, who are in the UK illegally to regularize their status. Look, I entirely sympathize with their desire to build a better life. Indeed, I might do exactly the same thing myself if I was in their circumstances. But if we're trying to reduce illegal immigration, it strikes me that an amnesty like this would do nothing to reduce illegal immigration, and it would act as an additional pull factor to those wishing to come to the UK. An amnesty like this, as the Honourable Member for Ipswich points out, is akin to open borders, and it means our immigration system would no longer be rules-based. And actually, the Member for Ipswich raises an interesting point, that if the party opposite were to put this in an election manifesto, it might not be a vote winner. Finally, can I say that I entirely support any efforts to attract undocumented people to vaccination centres without fear. Thank you.
Rashanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Hosey, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I want to thank the Honourable Member for Ipswich for opening the debate and laying out the different opinions, strongly held opinions on both sides of this debate. And I think it's really important for us to debate this issue because there are hundreds of thousands of people who are undocumented in our country. And it's important that we have as sensitive and nuanced a debate as possible on this very important issue, because by not discussing it, by not engaging with this subject, in fact, we create bigger problems for our society. In particular, Mr. Chairman, I want to focus on those who face severe exploitation because they found themselves as undocumented migrants in our country. I have no truck, as I'm sure most in our country don't, with those who are deliberately, willfully flouting our legal system and breaking the law in this country. But what I'm interested in is what we can do to protect those who arrived in this country who often, and according to the JCWI, arrived through legitimate means and found themselves becoming irregularized, and how we support those people. We have countless examples, including in many of our constituencies, of people facing violence, being trafficked, women facing domestic abuse, and sometimes they've arrived sometimes as spousal visas, and then faced huge amounts of exploitation. And although domestic violence is one of the areas where if you face domestic violence, you can apply to stay in the UK, even if your spouse doesn't sponsor you, it doesn't often pass many of the requirements, because if people don't have the police reports and so on, then it's quite difficult to prove to the immigration officers that they have faced domestic abuse and violence. So this is a complex area for those who face exploitation and who are vulnerable. And I have met many, many individuals who face those sorts of issues. That's why I think it's really important, although we may have differences of views about the text of the petition, that we look at how we can build some consensus around those who are particularly vulnerable, who should be given an amnesty. And the wider context for me is, in relation to this debate, is that in the last year, since the pandemic began, the issue of what we do with undocumented migrants, what healthcare provision they get, whether they have access to COVID vaccines, affects all of us. And that's why, in some respects, it's a no-brainer to look at some of these issues carefully and think about how it benefits us as a society in terms of health care and protection for all of us. And we've already heard some of the issues around vaccination programs and people being fearful of going to get vaccinated. And many GPs do require people to register with them in order to get access to these vaccines. There are one-off offers of getting vaccinated if you're an undocumented migrant, but it's not comprehensive. So in terms of public health benefits to the whole of society, if we're going to combat the pandemic, we need to make sure the estimated 800 to 1.2 million people that are, according to the JCWI, are undocumented in our country, are given the protection. In terms of what we do going forward, as someone has already referred to in an intervention, the Prime Minister has, even as recently as earlier this year, said when people have been here for a very long time and haven't fallen foul of the law, then it makes sense to try to regularise their status. He also talked about an earned amnesty when he was Mayor of London for some 400,000 people who live in the capital. So I think that it's important for us to look at how we address this issue in a way that is sensible, doesn't lead to a pull factor, which many have raised concerns about, where we can have a managed migration process where there are legitimate routes to coming here to make a contribution, whether to study, to work here, to join family members, while at the same time recognizing that some people came to this country over the past decade and beyond, who have, for different reasons, found themselves in the irregular status category, and they didn't break the law. Those are the people I'm particularly concerned about, who then fell foul of the system. So I hope that as we go forward, we'll be able to look at how we can arrive at a response that looks at protecting people who've been exploited, who've been trafficked, who've faced huge challenges in our country, and also look at the opportunities for where they can make a contribution to our economy, given they've been here for a long time. So while I don't agree with the exact wording of this motion, I think it's very important that we look at what we can do going forward to protect those who face huge vulnerabilities, but also to ensure that, given we are still in the middle of a pandemic, that those who are not documented have access to vaccination programs, testing, and also treatment against COVID.
Seema Malhotra. You're on mute, Seema.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. My constituency of Beltham and Hessen had the fourth highest number of signatories to this e-petition, reflecting in my...
Hold on. Can you speak up a little? I think there's something wrong with your microphone. We're not picking that up at all.
Is this any better?
That's better, yes.
Okay, let me try this. Thank you, Mr. Hody. It is my constituency of Beltham and Hessen had the fourth highest number of signatories.
Sorry, I'm really sorry. Whatever you did there, just put it back, and it was. We simply can't hear that, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Shall we try and
Let me try. If I hold this up, is that working?
Well, try like that, and if this doesn't work, we'll come back to you. On you go.
Thank you. My constituency of Beltham and Heston had the fourth highest number of signatories to the petition, reflecting, in my view, the sense of humanity in our local community.
Hold on, I do apologise, but this really isn't working. I think we'll have one of the engineers get in touch, and we'll try to come back to you if that's all right. All right? Because we're really not hearing that. Can I have Ruth Cadbury, please?
Thank you, Mr. Hosey, and I think it's my first time to serve under your chairship, and it's a great pleasure to do so. I rise to speak in this e-petition debate on undocumented migrants. It's been signed by over 900 of my constituents. The e-petition notes that, quote, undocumented migrants are suffering in silence with no access to adequate financial support or any help, unquote. I know from my own casework and from listening to the speakers so far that this assessment is sadly far too accurate. Not only are they suffering in silence, but their suffering is being made worse by the careless, heartless and reckless Home Office, which continues to inflict a hostile environment on so many. Long delays, irrational and inconsistent decisions, inadequate legal support, especially accessible to those with low or no income. Many people affected are victims of modern slavery. They're people they're adults who came over as small children, or their children joining the only family members they know are alive in this world. Now, the petition does say they want to be able to live their lives as normal human beings and pay tax to help the UK economy. And we do know, Mr. Hosey, that migrants are more likely to be net contributors. Migrants who have legal status and are taxpayers are more likely to be net contributors to the HMRC than the average population as a whole. Now, and I'm not saying I agree with all the wording of the petition, but it's really important that it's come today. I know that people accept. As the Joint Council for Welfare for Immigrants makes clear in their recent survey, 82% of people who are undocumented actually arrived in the UK through a legal route. So I'm going to start by addressing the extortionate and unfair immigration fees that not only impact those who are undocumented, but also all those who have to navigate our immigration system here in the UK. I know that people accept the concept of paying a fee to cover the cost of the service, but it's simply unfair for the Home Office to charge these excessive fees, well beyond the cost of actually providing the service. The fees are disproportionate compared with those of other countries. The average cost of a regularisation application in France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands or Germany is less than a tenth of the cost of that in the UK. And the cost of applying for permanent settlement in the UK is 20 times more than the average cost in those countries. And the government keeps increasing the fees. In 2014, the cost of a limited leave to remain application was £601. This has now risen to over £1,000 per person. For many applicants, this is multiplied by the number of people in their family. I know from listening to people locally that these costs are having huge impact, and the JCWI rightly cite the high cost of fees as being a major reason why people remain undocumented. These fees leave families in limbo, with JCWI noting that, and I quote, families who are unable to raise thousands of pounds every few years are at risk of losing their status and becoming undocumented, or forced to choose which family members maintain their status while others cannot, unquote. But it's not just the fees, it's about a wider system that's set up to create a hostile environment to undocumented migrants. We hear a lot of warm words from the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary and junior ministers about Home Office has changed since the appalling Windrush scandal. But the hostile environment that the Windrush generation faced is still impacting so many people here in the UK. And the net number of people it ensnares only seems to be expanding. Just this morning, we read in The Guardian of a Spanish woman who arrived in the UK. She was less than a year old when she arrived. She's been sacked from her job in a care home as she's unable to prove she had a right to work in the UK. She'd applied for settled status before the deadline for EU citizens settlement closed, but she's still waiting. And her employer said they were forced into this action because of the fines they faced. And of course, she won't be eligible to claim benefits until this is sorted out. It is not yet another example of the awful hostile environment, a hostile environment that I fear is now going to impact on the millions of EU citizens living in the UK, including many in my own constituency. And I want to finish, Mr. Hosey, by focusing on the real impact these decisions and actions by the Home Office have. It's easy for us to become focused on numbers, but every number is a story of a family pushed into hardship, unable to pay bills or cover the cost of food. In limbo, many have children who are UK citizens. So we know that undocumented migrants experience domestic violence at 3 times the average national rate, yet the government recently rejected an amendment to the domestic abuse bill that would have sought to provide support to migrant women suffering from abuse. So once again, the government rhetoric does not match the reality. This government cannot claim to be compassionate or just until it ends the hostile environment facing my constituents and many others around the country.
Manjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hosey, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I congratulate the well over 100,000 people who have signed this petition to secure this important debate. Indeed, many Slough constituents from my constituency have contacted me to raise their concerns, and over 2,100 of them have signed this official petition. What they are saying, Mr. Hosey, in essence, is that they reject the Home Office's hostile environment, and that what we need is a fair, transparent system which provides a safe harbour for those fleeing war, genocide, domestic abuse and violence and other forms of persecution, and which has at its heart our true British values of compassion, justice and humanitarianism, and highlighting that the UK system of asylum and immigration is mired in crisis. So while not advocating an open borders policy, we do need a fair, rules-based asylum and immigration policy. A recent report makes grim reading. The Joint Committee for the Welfare of Immigrants, JCWI, published a report called Here We Are just a few weeks ago. I'm sure that the Minister has read that. The report looks at the routes to people becoming undocumented, often a small error or a period of illness or bad advice or mental problems can lead to someone becoming undocumented and entering a Kafkaesque nightmare of impossible bureaucracy, social exclusion and exposure to the criminal underworld. These are people, Mr. Chairman, who are bewildered, disorientated, and traumatized, often suffering PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the system makes things worse for them. We know how people without access to benefits to work are coerced into criminal activity or forced into dangerous work. But what the pandemic has shamefully highlighted is that undocumented migrants are also denied access to basic healthcare. The JCWI reports that they are scarred by the whole experience and are scared of seeing a GP, going to hospital, or getting a COVID vaccination for sheer fear of arrest. I don't need to tell the Minister that this creates a danger to public health for everyone. There is obviously, Mr. Chairman, a huge unmet need for vaccinations. Isn't it clear that the only people the current system helps are criminals? We are fueling exploitation and rewarding organized crime groups and people traffickers. The Joint Council for the Welfare of Refugees has set out a series of entirely sensible policies, namely a new simplified routes to status based on 5 years residence, British citizenship for children born in the UK, making visa renewals automatic and affordable, and scrapping the illegal working offence and creating a route to status through work. And what have the Prime Minister and his Conservative government proposed instead? Mr. Chairman, it's hypocrisy, backtracking, and hostility. The Prime Minister himself advocated for the creation of a migrants' amnesty when he was London Mayor in 2008. In 2016, as Foreign Secretary, he called measures to give amnesty for those undocumented migrants who had lived in the UK for longer than 10 years, and I quote, economically rational. Yet now, after raising so many people's hopes, and when he has the opportunity as Prime Minister to make a real difference, to ensure it's easier and simpler for those who are undocumented to become regularized, he has done nothing for the last 2 years. It's just not fair, Mr. Chairman, for those who could make a huge positive contribution through taxes to our exchequer and who have to suffer excessive Home Office fees, as honourable members have already highlighted, to have their hopes falsely raised and then cruelly dashed. So when the Minister makes his speech, I hope that he will have the confidence to deviate from the notes prepared by Home Office officials and engage with these points in particular with the seriousness that they merit, and end this uncertainty which has devastating consequences for the lives it impacts, because those undocumented migrants who have been here for several years deserve clarity. Thank you very much, Mr. Housen.
I'm going to go back to Feltham and Heston, and we'll see if we have any more luck. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Housen. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. My constituency of Feltham and Heston had the fourth highest number of signatories to this e-petition, reflecting in my...
I am really sorry that we're going to try and get your volume up, but hold on one second. That's better. On you go.
Okay. Reflecting, in my view, the humanity of our local community, recognising our rich history of immigration and diversity. With over 150 languages spoken in Hounslow alone, our diversity is also our strength. Neighbours, colleagues, business owners and key workers come from all over the world and contribute to our local economy. This is an important debate that focuses on a very specific issue, action to support undocumented migrants. And I support the call from my honourable friend, Member for Bethnal Green and Roe, for a consensus on how we move forward. Caritas Europa defines the challenge well in saying that while the fight against irregular migration has dominated the political agenda for years, undocumented migrants remain a sizable population in Europe. The lack of a regular resident status often goes hand in hand with a huge amount of suffering and vulnerability. Referred to as undocumented migrants or people without papers, these people may find themselves in a protracted limbo situation, living on the margin of society, under continuous stress and anxiety, their basic rights often disregarded.
And we know there are hundreds of thousands of undocumented migrants, as has been said in this debate, being blocked from booking COVID vaccinations, despite government ministers saying everyone should have access to vaccines, regardless of immigration status. As a result, we are all less safe. Now, this issue is not without complexity, but we cannot be without humanity and compassion. The current system locks people out of vital services, often families with children. The research conducted by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants shows that 82% of respondents to their surveys entered the UK through legal routes and later fell out of status. Expensive and stressful reapplication processes, which can cost over £12,000 by the time genuine cases are granted indefinite leave to remain, push families into enormous debt that lasts for years. These extortionate fees are not a deterrent. Instead, they push people into exploitative work. These are people who are ambitious to do well for themselves, their families, and their adopted country. This was the case with Navin, not his real name, who JCWI noted became undocumented after he was wrongly advised by a lawyer that his leave was still valid. He attempted to rectify this when right-to-work checks meant that he lost his steady job in a restaurant. He couldn't afford to pay the fees required to regularize the status of his entire family, leaving them all undocumented. He took on cash-in-hand work at a car wash. He was regularly underpaid or simply not paid at all, and feared that social services would take his children away if they found out about his situation. He said, "My kids were born here, and I don't know where else I would go. I've got nothing back in Mauritius at all, no family, no one I know. I left when I was young, a long time ago, and here I have my life and my family." In so many cases, falling out of status is due to situations outside of the control of the migrant. JCWI's research found that this can happen for that variety of reasons too, including relationship breakdown, domestic violence, poor legal advice, inability to pay those extremely high fees, or a simple mistake. But once a migrant falls out of crisis, out of status, it can be very difficult to obtain it again. And this impact of falling out of status results in people being trapped in limbo. Like these stories, the vast majority of undocumented migrants have been settled in the UK for more than 5 years, or indeed more than 10, and they arrive legally. The UK has the second largest number of undocumented migrants in Europe, behind Germany. And the insecurity and often destitution of these families has worsened through the pandemic, with many dependent also on food banks. It's an intractable solution that needs a different approach. That's why I believe it is time the government reforms the current system to create a simplified route to regularisation, so that migrants can access services, rent a home, work and pay taxes, and live a life free from fear. Now, addressing these, the damagingly high application fees alongside simplifying the process is an approach that has been taken in Ireland. And according to the Institute for Public Policy Research, there are also precedents for an amnesty policy intervention. And it's interesting to see that Greece, Italy, and Portugal have all implemented amnesty programs in recent months. There's also clear economic evidence. If undocumented migrants can move out of informal employment and into more secure jobs, there are many benefits for wider society. According to The Economist, studies in America suggest that citizenship for their 11 million undocumented immigrants could boost the economy, with GDP rising up to $1.5 trillion over 10 years. So in conclusion, Mr. Hosey, undocumented migrants clearly need a different way that they and their families can move forward. The JVCI powerfully remarks that once someone becomes undocumented, the criminalization of their everyday lives drives them into exploitation. Their voices are silenced. They are almost unable to tell anyone about their plight. Under the hostile environment, almost everyone who should keep them safe are part of the system of immigration enforcement and surveillance, trying to rip them away from their families and their homes. Mr. Hosey, we need a sensitive, long-term solution to the undocumented migrants crisis. As a first step, we should make it easier for those who are undocumented to become regularized by simplifying the process, and reform the extremely high fees, which means that people cannot pay for visa applications. Surely, in the interest of our economy, effective administration, which COVID now demands, and in the interest of humanity, there needs to be a much better answer to undocumented migrants than we have now. Thank you.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Hosey. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I congratulate the member for Ipswich for securing this important debate. I disagree wholeheartedly with the member. I especially congratulate the more than 100,000 people who signed the petition calling for this debate, including the over 1,200 Leicester East residents. Whilst I wholeheartedly support the petition's call for the urgent regularisation of undocumented migrants with a safe pathway to citizenship after 5 years, I politely suggest that its use of the word amnesty is not quite accurate, because amnesty implies wrongdoing. The reality is, in nearly all cases, undocumented people are not criminals, but simply people who have fallen through the cracks of the government's callous, hostile environment policies. Last year, I tabled an early day motion calling on the government to take immediate action to ensure that leave to remain is granted to undocumented migrants, irrespective of their nationality or immigration status, so that they can access healthcare, food, and housing. This issue, of course, came to a head when it was clear that undocumented migrants would be left off the vaccination program. It was clear to many that we were only ever going to be as safe as the most vulnerable amongst us. I pushed again early this year, including another early day motion for undocumented migrants to be granted leave to remain, so that no one is excluded from this necessary protection. Not only are such exclusionary practices morally abhorrent, but they also undermine the whole purpose of a vaccine. Whilst people and institutions discriminate, the virus does not. The only way for the vaccine to be effective is to ensure that everyone is protected from this virus. Most migrants enter the UK through legal routes. The Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants estimate that this to be 82%, as we've heard. Every 2.5 years, a migrant must pay thousands per person to stay. A migrant on the 10-year route will have paid 12,937 in fees alone. They will have been denied legal aid to seek legal advice about or appeal the refusal of their applications. If at any point they are unable to submit the right application at the right time and with the required fee, they will become undocumented. This is deeply unjust. There are an estimated 1 million undocumented workers who lack any entitlement to support from the state and who are therefore entirely without funds to feed, clothe and house themselves and their families. For a demographic that already faces uncommonly difficult challenges in their daily lives, the pandemic has only deepened fears over how to maintain an income, remain healthy, or even stay alive. Many undocumented people are destitute and living in the shadows, fearful of what will happen to them if they identify themselves. They cannot access healthcare, emergency shelter and food, nor report or seek protection from domestic violence, sexual assault, exploitation and other awful abuses. Following the Immigration Act of 2014 and 2016, the invisibility in which undocumented migrants are required to live has led to many of their human rights being effectively denied by criminalising the right to work and rent housing, whilst limiting access to healthcare, contravening Article 25 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For people forced to endure this level of instability, it is impossible to comply with any government guidance on self-isolation and social distancing. It is morally and practically imperative that the basic needs of all those who are living in our country are met. The tragic irony is that many undocumented people who are living in constant fear of the British state work in frontline services that the government have been at pains to clap hands for. And in essence, hold on.
I think we'll move swiftly on.
For people, sorry, Miss sorry, Mr. Hosey. The tragic irony is that many undocumented people who are living in constant fear of the British state work in frontline services that the government have been in pains to praise during this crisis. We must ensure that all workers, regardless of their immigration status, are valued, are protected as we rebuild our economy and society. It is essential for the government to take immediate action to ensure that leave to remain is granted to everyone in the UK, irrespective of their nationality or immigration status. All migrants, regardless of status, ought to be granted rights that respect their humanity and allow them to live with dignity and fully participate in society. At a time when hate crime has more than doubled since 2013, it has never been more important for the government's demonisation of migrants to end. Together, we can build a society in which everyone is valued, no matter their country of birth. Now, more than ever, what is needed is status now. Thank you, Mr. Hosey.
Cyril.
Thank you, Mr. Hosey, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Human beings are not illegal. First and foremost, they're humans. For me, that has to be the starting point of this debate and any debate about immigration. Over the last few days, I've been contacted by dozens of people from across Luton North asking me to speak in this debate. And I was glad to see 446 people from across my constituency had signed this petition online. This shows the strength of feeling of many of my constituents and our unifying belief in human rights for women and children in particular, who are fleeing some of the most horrific circumstances across this world. When you're locked out of the system and shut out of paths of safe legal routes through the immigration system, you're unable to get a job, you can't rent a home, you can't open a bank account or obtain a driver's license. It is not an easy life. People living here from abroad are considered temporary for a decade and must reapply for the right to remain in their homes and jobs every 2.5 years. Each of these applications, as we've heard already, costs thousands of pounds per person. At present, a migrant on the 10-year route to settlement will have paid £12,937 in application fees by the time they are granted indefinite leave to remain. I'm sure that most of us here as MPs will see the impact this has on people's family life, well-being, in our own inboxes and casework. The 10-year route to settlement is a default route for most categories of visa holders. If at any point during this 10-year period, the visa holder is unable to submit the right application at the right time, they will be classified as undocumented. Now, research by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants found that this can happen for a variety of reasons, including relationship breakdown, domestic violence, poor legal advice, their or a relative's physical or mental health crisis, an inability to pay extremely high fees, or just a simple, honest mistake. We're currently seeing with this pandemic how the ability for everyone in this country to access healthcare is crucial to our country's collective well-being. Healthcare, which, as a principle, should be free at the point of use in our country. This virus doesn't care what you look like. It doesn't care where you come from. If you're living in poor conditions or are too scared to get the vaccine because of what might happen to you, or if you leave a paper trail for the NHS and you are scared of that, this virus will catch up with you. And I pay tribute to all the vaccination hubs, which are reaching out specifically to these overlooked groups. In my role as the co-chair for the APPG on hate crime, my noble friend Lord Sheikh and I have been taking up the difficulties that undocumented people have been facing during this pandemic, specifically around vaccination. And I welcome the Vaccines Minister's early announcement that you will not need an NHS number or a fixed address to get a vaccine. But they are not the only barriers for people reaching out for help. I wrote to him in March asking how his department is actively reaching out to this incredibly hard to reach group. I'm still waiting for a response from him, but maybe the Minister here today can shed some light on that, because since March, I appreciate everybody's busy, but that is a very long time to wait for a cross-party letter and response from APPG. In the end, this debate is ultimately about our values as a country. I'm not a fully fledged football fan, but I am a fan of our England team because of who they are and because of what they represent. It's the kind of England that stands up for and alongside one another. But does our government reflect this? Do our leaders treat other human beings as equals? Over the last 11 years, we've seen a hostile environment for people in our country from overseas grow in our own country. A hostile environment where vans are driven around neighbourhoods, where people's aunts, people's nans, granddads, uncles have lived for years telling them to go home or face prosecution. A hostile environment where as many as 170,000 NHS heroes from overseas are still waiting for the refunds they were promised by the Prime Minister for the charges they have to pay to use the NHS that they work in and support. And a hostile environment where if you're from overseas and your first language isn't English, you're more likely to have contracted COVID and you're more likely to have ended up in hospital over the last year. Even just today, we are seeing currently a bill being debated in the main chamber that would see our country turn its back on some of the most vulnerable people in the world. It risks breaching international law, lowering our global standard as a country even further than it has done now, and undermines global efforts to support victims of war and persecution, all while criminalising even the RNLI lifeboats for saving people from drowning in the English Channel. What have we become? A human being is a human being, and our responsibility to others isn't determined on what passport somebody holds. To me, one of Luton's strengths is its diversity. You can visit the whole world in one street, and a dear friend of mine coined a phrase, one town, many voices. And that is very true of where I live now. Our government could learn a lot from Luton. And it's time that this government stopped with the divide and rule style of politics, because we're all poorer for it.
John McDonnell.
Thanks, Chair. Before I comment on the speeches so far, let me just say this. I visited the Crown Plaza, the hotel in my constituency today, which has housed asylum seekers for the last year. And this weekend, a young Sudanese man died at the hotel. I won't name him because I'm not sure whether his family have been contacted yet. But I want to send my condolences and sympathy to all his friends I met today. And it exemplified to me the precarious nature of the life of many of the people who come here to seek safety and security. We're not sure of the causes of death, but I just say also there were reports this morning about the large numbers of young men who've come here and actually then gone on to take their own lives. I think we need to learn some lessons and approach this whole issue with some compassion. I've listened to all the speeches and I don't think I can add to any of the recommendations that have been made by one. So all I can do maybe is just bring my experience, because sometimes these debates are no longer rational, they're delivered by emotion. So let me insert some of the emotions I feel. And I've been dealing with asylum seekers in my constituency for over 40 years as an activist campaigning for our local law centre, or as a GLC councillor and then as the local MP. And I've met hundreds of asylum seekers, hundreds of families, and their lives, undocumented, have been scarred and by sometimes broken by the asylum system that we now have. As others have said, it's complex, it's slow, it's incompetent, it's inefficient, it's brutal, and it's inhumane. And yes, it's expensive, especially for those who are living in poverty, because they've been forced by the hostile environment onto the margins of our society, and because there's no access to legal aid. And as someone has already said, most of the people we're talking with here came legally into the country and went into the process but dropped out. But the experience I've had of people dropping out is largely, I have to say, first because of appallingly poor legal advice in many instances, people being ripped off, expensive legal advice that was going nowhere, but also dropping out because of the huge mental health issues that they've faced, both in their country of origin, the suffering they went through, but also their travels here, and then when they were treated here in a place where they thought they would find security and succour. And the issue around the fees is important because by criminalising work for these people, it means that they are exploited. In the cases I've dealt with, is because work has been criminalised, it does force them into illegal work, being ripped off, often not paid, And also I've dealt with many women who've been exploited sexually as a result of their vulnerability because their work is illegal. And then in some instances I've had where they have gone to the authorities and reported it, then they get picked up themselves as an illegal. So that's why people don't report and don't identify often the perpetrators, some of the appalling acts of exploitation and, as I said, sexual violence in some instances. So I agree with all those proposals that have been put forward by my honourable friends. Some members who've spoken today may not accept an amnesty. I think an amnesty has worked elsewhere, as others have said, and I think it should be considered, just as the Prime Minister considered when he was the Mayor for London, and I welcome those statements then that he made. But if people can't go as far as that, the honourable members for Slough and Feltham and Heston and others have set out a number of reforms which I think are readily available to us and could transform the lives of literally hundreds of thousands of people that are living within our community. And just, they come here for safety and security, but also they want to contribute to the society, the host community in particular, when they've arrived here. I just want to add one further reform I'd like the government to consider, which is the scrapping of the no recourse to public funds, because it is forcing people into destitution, exploitation, and in many instances, situations of vulnerability that actually do not just put their health at risk, but their lives at risk. I think the plea from the petition, and 4,000 of my constituents, nearly 4,000 of my constituents signed the petition. I think the plea from all of those people is the same that others have made round the table today, which is this system isn't working. It's not working even on the government's own terms, because 90% of them, 99% of the people aren't intimidated by the hostile environment to return to their countries of origin because they're so vulnerable there. So that's why, if the system is not working, even in the government's own terms, now's the time for reform. And it's needed urgently because people are suffering. And as we've experienced today in my constituency, people are dying out there as well. Thanks, Chair.
Anne McLaughlin, 8 minutes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Hosea, may I say what an absolute joy it is to serve under your chairmanship, even though we're not speaking about anything particularly joyous today. Mr. Hosea, I've just come from the House of Commons chamber, where right this minute, as we debate the suffering of undocumented migrants on these islands, the Nationality and Borders Bill is getting its second reading. A horrible, horrible piece of legislation which would discriminate against those who, according to the Refugee Convention, to which we are signatories, enter the UK legally, but by boat. It will give preferential treatment to those who've been fortunate enough to be able to use the very few safe and legal routes. The debate here today is about undocumented migrants stuck in a legal limbo, trying to find a route to resettlement. And what we're hearing today is that even when migrants do use those safe and legal routes, the state often continues to neglect, to discriminate, and to punish, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. Myself and a number of my SNP colleagues signed and supported an EDM by the Honourable Member for Streatham on the regularisation of undocumented migrants in May of this year, and many of my colleagues have regularly spoken about this issue. As myself and others have said, there can be numerous reasons why someone becomes undocumented. They might not be able to get legal advice. Life might have got in the way, for example, a bereavement or an illness, theirs or someone close to them. They might make minor mistakes on their application. A friend of mine sent a copy of her wedding certificate instead of the original. And yes, it was her mistake, but instead of allowing her to rectify, she had to go through the entire palaver again, including paying the fee again. And as several honourable members have said, a big reason is that many are simply unable to pay the extortionate application fees, and that was outlined by the honourable member for Brentford and Isleworth. And also worth noting is some honourable members, including the member for Bethnal Green and Bow, talked about as people being trafficked into onto these islands. Something my friend and colleague, the Honourable Member for Cumbernauld, Forsyth and Kirkintilloch East has talked about repeatedly is the cost involved for children registering their right to British citizenship. Most people would, I think, be surprised to hear that children born here are not automatically citizens, and indeed they used to be, but this was repealed by the British Nationality Act, which came into force in 1983. However, at least in 1983, a fee of just £30, equivalent to £100 today, was charged to register a child as a British citizen. And it really does beg the question why the Home Office currently charges over £1,000 for a migrant child to register. Not even a migrant child, a child born here of migrants. I appreciate this is under review at the moment only because the courts are forcing the government to look again. I want to share the story of Paul, one of my constituents from Nigeria. Of course, that's not his name. He was on minimum wage, so he was just getting by and no more, but he was doing a really good job, keeping a roof over his son's head, making sure he was healthy and educated, all the things you would hope a good dad would do. He realised his leave to remain was due to be renewed or considered, so he went to apply only to discover the cost. It was over £2,000, which would have required him to save up £1,000 for every year of his leave to remain, and that's just not possible on minimum wage. His leave then to remain then expired, so he became an undocumented migrant, but he was doing nothing wrong. His employer had to let him go because he didn't have the right to work. He'd no recourse to public funds, and I completely agree with what the Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington says about that, because this meant he was left with no food, no electricity, and rising rent arrears. He didn't know what to do. He'd no choice but to send his son to live with his mum. By the time I met up with Paul, he was in a terrible state. He'd been unable to face responding to the letters from his housing association, and they were now ready to evict him. I must say that when I contacted them, they couldn't have been more helpful. Reassured by the fact that I had a meeting with the Minister to plead his case, they agreed to pause proceedings. They then gave him money to get food and electricity, and I really want to thank Spireview Housing Association for doing that. But it was also unnecessary, and we've heard that so many times today. And here's the other problem. Paul got 2.5 years leave to remain after the fee was waived. The first year of that we've all spent in lockdown, so understandably, he is still unemployed. In around a year's time, he's going to have to apply again for an extension, and he'll have to find another £2,500 or hope the fees will be waived. But there's certainly no guarantee it will be, and if it's not, he will yet again be an undocumented migrant. With the best will in the world, if he gets another job and it's minimum wage again, it is not possible for him to pay back his rent arrears, clocked up through no fault of his own, and save up that amount of money. And I'm also going to say that Paul's was the first case that I took to the Minister sitting opposite, and to his credit, he sorted it out. And I do thank him for that, but we can't keep going to the Minister with every single case. However, that said, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight the case of another constituent who contacted me at the weekend to say that because of an error, his fee for his wife's spousal visa had been taken twice. In November, he was told by the Home Office it would be refunded within 6 weeks. He's still waiting, and last week, for the umpteenth time, he was told it would be with him in 6 weeks again. To add insult to injury, each phone call he makes costs him £5 because of the 65p a minute charge. Mr Hosey, he really needs that £2,000. The Home Office agrees that they owe him it, and I hope the Minister will offer, when he speaks, to look into this urgently for me, as he did with Paul. I can see you looking at me, so I'm going to sum up now, Mr Hosey, and just say that finally I would urge the Honourable Member for Ipswich, a place I went on holiday last year, to read what the Prime Minister actually said about the notion of an amnesty for undocumented migrants. And as welcome as some form of amnesty would be for those currently battling for the right to remain, the system as a whole needs reform. The hostile environment is alive and kicking, and following an amnesty, we would only bear witness to a whole new generation of migrants subjected to this endless cycle. Let's reform the whole system, root and branch, and save ourselves and them all of this unnecessary grief. Otherwise, as the Honourable Member for Luton North said, what have we become? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Hosey, and it's a pleasure to serve on your chairmanship. I'd like to begin by congratulating the 103,440 people who signed the e-petition, including 447 from my constituency of Enfield Southgate, which enabled this debate to take place. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Ipswich for taking this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. It's not often that I find myself speaking in a debate where the Prime Minister has a different view from the official government position, but this is one such time. On previous occasions, both as Mayor of London and as Cabinet Minister, the Prime Minister stated his support for having an amnesty for undocumented migrants. Whereas the government say that the immigration rules already provide for undocumented migrants to regularise their status, and that such provision would unduly reward those who have not complied with immigration law. This fails to recognise the reality of the situation, that there are tens of thousands of people in the UK who are undocumented, and the government is either unaware of them, which smacks of incompetence, or else unwilling to deal with the problem. As the Prime Minister pointed out in a radio interview on LBC in 2013, when he was Mayor of London, "You've been here for more than 10 to 12 years, the authorities no longer pursue you, they give up. Why not be honest about what's going on? You've got to reflect reality, because otherwise they're not engaged in the economy, they're not being honest with the system, they're not paying their taxes properly, and it's completely crazy." But expanding on the topics the Prime Minister touched on, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, in their excellent briefing on this debate, point out that according to their research, 82% of those who are here and who are undocumented have actually arrived in the UK via legal routes and then fallen out of status. And that's a point that my honourable friend, the member for Feltham and Heston, made very passionately. And so the first point I wish to make is that the present immigration system and its cost is a factor in people becoming undocumented. And many members, including my honourable friend, the member for Isleworth, made the issue about the cost of making applications to become regularised. The prime route for acquiring indefinite leave to remain is 10 years of continuous residency. But first you have to apply for temporary leave to remain for 2.5 years and then keep renewing it until you've acquired the 10 years. Now, applying for leave to remain is expensive. A successful applicant under this route would have had to pay a total of £12,937 in fees. And the application process is also very complex, and lots of evidence is required to be submitted. And if you slip up just once and don't submit the correct forms when it falls due, then during the 10 years, then you'll become undocumented. And as a consequence, adult undocumented migrants will then only be able to regularise their status by applying for indefinite leave to remain. But they can only qualify for ILR if they're aged 18 to 25 and have lived in the UK for over half their lives, or else if they're over 25, they have to show they've lived in the UK for over 20 years and can prove that they have strong ties to the UK and cannot relocate to the country of origin. And talk about making it tough for people to regularise their status. And what this smacks of is a continuation of the hostile environment that was so mercilessly used against certain sections of the community. With undocumented migrants being denied access to work, accommodation and health services, they're easy prey for those who want to exploit them. And as a consequence, they're driven underground, working in under-the-counter work, totally dependent on shady individuals who they now serve. And the exploitation of migrants was excellently commented upon by my honourable friends, the member of Bethnal Green and Bow and Hayes and Harlington. As the Prime Minister pointed out, if tens of thousands of undocumented migrants are working but not paying taxes, then that will impact on the economy. And so it's in everyone's interest to make sure that urgent action is taken to regularise their status. And it's not just the economy that would benefit, so would our public health. As it was only last week that we heard that in some parts of London, undocumented migrants were being turned away from GP surgeries where they were trying to get vaccinated against COVID because they're reluctant to give their name and addresses for fear of being arrested. Meanwhile, those who were turned away were not being putting themselves at risk, but as my honourable friends, the member for Luton North and Leicester East pointed out, they're risking spreading it amongst the wider community. The Home Office don't even know roughly how many undocumented migrants are present in the UK, and were heavily criticised for this by the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee and the report on immigration enforcement in September 2020. Another problem the government faces is that they have hollowed out the immigration enforcement system, and as such they have in effect outsourced this service to the general public, leaving it up to landlords, employers and the NHS to notify the government if someone is undocumented. The National Audit Office last did an estimate of undocumented migrants in 2005, and they put the figure of people who are undocumented and living and working in the UK at 430,000. There's been no official assessment of the number since then. So not only did the government not know the scale of the problem, but even if they did, these figures are still accurate, they couldn't do much about it. I wonder if the Minister can tell me whether the Home Office have made any assessment of the number of people who are currently here and who are undocumented. And what's the government's plan for tackling this issue? The Minister will no doubt say that anyone who is here and is undocumented is here illegally. But if the government know this, what are they doing about it? And even if the Prime Minister doesn't believe, the Home Office will detain and deport 430,000 people. And so we have a perfect storm of the government being aware of the problem and being unable and unwilling to deal with it, and tens of thousands of people, undocumented, living and working in the UK. The petition proposes an amnesty for all undocumented migrants, but a more comprehensive approach would be to focus on an accessible routes to regularise the system and having more meaningful reforms, as mentioned by my honourable friends, the member for Slough and Ealing Southall, to stop people from falling out of status. And this would offer a longer-term solution to the problem. And I know the Irish government are currently looking at new plans for a fairer pathway to regularisation for undocumented migrants with a period of 4 years residency in Ireland. The current methods of regularising status in the UK are onerous and cumbersome and need an urgent overhaul. And in addition, the exorbitant level of fees for visas is scandalous and clearly another barrier designed to make it harder for people to regularise their status. A continuation of the Home Office's malevolent, hostile environment. And so I asked the Minister, as this problem is not going away anytime soon, will the government make it easier for undocumented people to have their status regularised? And what is the long-term plan for addressing the problem? It's surely in all our interests that the basic needs of everyone here are met and that undocumented or otherwise, everyone can contribute safely, openly and without fear to our communities. And for that to happen, we need to see change. Thank you,
Well, thank you, Mr. Hosian. It's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I'd also like to thank my friend, the member for Ipswich, for opening this debate, which is always quite a challenge when opening a petition debate compared to others. And it has been an interesting debate, and I will attempt to respond to the points raised today, but I do hope colleagues will appreciate that with 8 minutes, it's probably unlikely I'm going to give a full gambit of our entire immigration rules and the position in this area. Perhaps the first point I wanted to deal with was to reflect on comments I made at the dispatch box last year at the start of the pandemic period, which was to make very clear that those approaching the NHS in relation to COVID-19, exhibiting symptoms and therefore looking for treatment or looking for vaccination, that the information that they give in relation to that will not be used for the purposes of immigration enforcement. Their status will not be checked. That is not a relevant consideration if they are approaching the NHS for treatment. And in relation to vaccination, we not only would encourage people to come forward for it, but have facilitated those who've arrived irregularly to be able to access the vaccination services. I would make clear, given some of the stuff we've had on the internet about this, that is in line with how, if they were a UK national, they would have been able to access vaccination. So now it's available to all over 18. It would be available to someone over 18 on that basis as well. So just to make that very clear, given some of the comments we've had throughout the debate, that from a Home Office perspective, the NHS's operations around tackling the pandemic are not items that we will look to use for any purpose of immigration enforcement. So in starting, it might be helpful if I set out some of the background on the issue we've been debating today. And first, it should be noted the definition and coverage of this group is complex. The term undocumented migrants often interchanges with illegal or irregular migration. And as evidenced in this debate, it can include illegal entrants, those who've arrived perhaps in the back of a lorry, overstayers, those who've stayed beyond the term of their visa, failed asylum seekers whose claims have been declined, those not adhering to the conditions of their stay, and even those who remain in the UK without status, but whose situation is temporary and they intend to leave in short order. So for today, I will include all these groups in our definition. Secondly, there is no current, reliable and accurate estimate for the number of those without status who are resident in the UK. And as my shadow touched on, the last official government estimate was in the mid-2000s, where the population was believed to be around 430,000. A report by the London School of Economics in 2009 estimated the number of irregular migrants was around 618,000. And there's an obvious part of the problem in formulating an accurate estimate is calculating and bringing together not just the different groups this population involves, but for obvious reasons, many of them will not come into contact with the Home Office or make their presence known here in the UK. And therefore, when we look at this petition, it is proposing an immediate amnesty for all of those groups, and provided they don't have a criminal record. I've got less than 5 minutes, I'm afraid, and this has been a lengthy debate. The government remains committed to an immigration policy which welcomes and celebrates people here legally, but also deters illegal immigration. We want to encourage people with skills and potential from around the world to make the UK their home and help make the UK a dynamic global economy. But we must not reward those who exploit the system and break the rules. We must also prevent the abuse of benefits and services paid for by UK taxpayers and disrupt the criminals who exploit and profit from the vulnerable, who will be tempted to use dangerous, irregular routes to get here if they can see a clear reward at the end of it. This is right both for the British public who pay for welfare services and those wishing to visit and settle in the UK who play by the rules. The government recognises we have a responsibility to help the vulnerable and have established several schemes and programmes to assist those most in need. One example is the work we have done to resettle genuine refugees who are fleeing directly from regions of conflict and instability and providing necessary support to help them build their life in the UK, integrate and become self-sufficient members of our society. The government has offered protection to 25,000 people in the last 6 years in this way, more than any other country in Europe in this period through a planned resettlement scheme. And this is in addition to welcoming a further 29,000 people for refugee family reunion between 2015 and 2019. And we've also recently introduced a new pathway to citizenship for British national overseas status holders and their family members facing draconian new security laws in Hong Kong, with an estimated 5.4 million people potentially being eligible for this scheme. And we do believe that a fair and balanced system is vital to guaranteeing integrity in the UK's immigration system. And we must support those most in need, but we also must make sure there is a cost for those who intend to break the rules, as have all governments of all political colours since the introduction of our modern immigration system, despite some of the comments we've heard today. And the proposal to offer amnesty to all those without permission to be in the UK undermines the integrity and effective working of the UK immigration system. To regularise the stay of those who have willfully and deliberately broken the rules is first and foremost an affront to those who have done the right thing and migrated here lawfully and contributed by paying visa fees and the immigration surcharge. And an amnesty for those not playing by the rules could prove divisive for those groups who will feel an injustice when they've complied with our policies, and it's safe to say it is unlikely to build public confidence in the migration system. And as the member for Ipswich said, it would certainly be something be interesting to see the public reaction if this type of policy was included in an election manifesto. And that this debate is not just about those who now realise, but what we do realise this debate is not just about the impact of those ignoring our migration rules and refusing to leave, but it is also about making sure the public feels there is confidence in the system. And why would you bother to apply for status? Why would you bother to renew your visa if you knew you could just stay and be granted a status anyway? Now, a point ignored by the petition and by some members is the immigration routes already provide for undocumented migrants who have not broken the law except for remaining here without lawful immigration status. And this includes, I've got less than 2 minutes, I'm afraid. I appreciate the chairman wants to give people time, but the minister's got 8 minutes, that's pretty short. So people who fear the situation in their country of origin may choose to claim asylum, and there's no cost to this. Those with qualifying family members present and settled in the UK can apply under the family rules, for example, where there is a qualifying partner and there are insurmountable obstacles to family life continuing outside the UK. And the private life rules provide for those within the UK for a particularly long time to regularise their status here. We said, though, we are in the process of reform of our immigration rules, and as many members may be aware, I have met with the group We Belong to discuss the current process in relation to those who arrived here as children or were born here but did not qualify for British citizenship. And we aim to simplify the settlement rules in the near future as part of our wider work on the new migration system, which will include some changes in response to the points raised by them, and will reduce the numbers ending up on the 10-year route to settlement, which we accept too many are remaining on. So whilst, Mr. Hosey, I've had to give a fairly short summary of the response, we do not believe that granting an amnesty as proposed by this petition would be appropriate. It would undermine the rules, and actually it would make the whole point of creating rules pointless if you could just ignore them and get status anyway.
Right. Tom Hunt for a brief wind-up.
Thank you very much. And, for chairing the debate so expertly, and thank you for the Minister for his response, and for every other participant in this debate for making it what I believe was actually a pretty well-tempered debate, a balanced debate. on well, I wouldn't worry. I'm not gonna on a pretty balanced debate where I think we've heard both sides of the argument, and I think there is a shared concern for the individuals in question, but this is a very complicated issue with unintended consequences. And it seems to me that actually the petition's call, which is pretty much blanket amnesty for every single undocumented migrant, I think there's actually very few members in this debate who agreed with that. But I do think there is space somewhere for like a pretty, very important debate about how we could potentially do something in this space. But I think obviously one of the real concerns here is what amnesties might mean in terms of encouraging future illegal crossings, etc. So in some respects, I actually think if the party opposite were to support the bill going through Parliament today, they might actually find, and if that were to be successful, of course I hope it is successful in passing Parliament, they may think that actually the public are in a much better place for having a debate about a reasoned amnesty and pathway for citizenship if there was that confidence that in doing so, it wouldn't fuel future illegal crossings from the continent. I think actually that might well be, and I think that may be at some point where we get to, where if there is confidence that we have that rules-based immigration system, where we're confident that we're in a better position to tackle illegal crossings and to make those determinations about the people who aspire to live in our country, maybe at that point we could have this important debate. I think there's actually some shortcomings potentially with the amnesty for those who've been over here for over 10 years. I think that comes with its own shortcomings. I did say I saw some of the arguments in favour of it, but I think it's a complicated issue. But clearly, I think very productive debate, and I think that it needs to be debated much further. I'm sure it will be. Thank you again for the over 100,000 people who signed the petition, and hopefully they will feel at the very least that the issue, in a general sense, has had a good airing and it's been thoroughly debated.
Commissioners, this House is considering petition 56768, one relating to an amnesty for undocumented migrants. As many as are of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Will members please leave the room promptly by the exit door